On July 21st, 2020, a 911 call shattered the quiet of Marin County. A male's voice, unsteady but determined, said he had killed a man and buried him in his backyard. But almost everything he said after that began to shift. Because the truth wasn't only in the ground where he buried a man he had killed, it was in the earlier gunshot reports, the missing weapon he used, the phone calls, and a backyard of his that told a different story every time he tried to explain it. On July 21st, 2020, a dispatcher in Marin County answered a call that changed the shape of a summer afternoon. The line clicked, the room hummed with the low electric buzz of headsets and screens, and then a man's voice cut through. He didn't stumble over his name, he stumbled over the truth. "My name is Jonathan. I killed somebody." He didn't shout. He didn't whisper. He spoke like a person trying to fit a boulder through a narrow door, slow, strained, and careful not to drop it. The dispatcher asked the first questions any trained ear will ask. Are you safe? Is anyone else in danger? Are there weapons? Who is the victim? The answers came in fragments. Safe. No one else here. No weapons now. And then, when asked who, silence. He finally gave only this. He was a bad man. The words were heavy and also hollow. They could be true. They could be an excuse. On a phone line, one sentence can be both. Officers were sent out. 2 patrol units, lights running but sirens off. The house sat in a quiet neighborhood that looked like most quiet neighborhoods at noon. Cars in driveways, a lawn mower somewhere in the distance, a dog announcing the arrival of strangers. Jonathan stood at the door when they arrived. He wasn't holding anything. He kept his hands where anyone could see them, fingers spread, palms forward. He looked tired, like he had forgotten how to rest. "Let's step outside," an officer said, and Jonathan agreed. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He did what many people do when they have finally run out of places to hide. He cooperated, because the hiding had already failed. They asked again about weapons. He said the gun was not in the house. He was firm on that point, but not on much else. When they asked where the body was, his eyes moved past them and toward the yard. "Back there," he said, pointing toward a garden window that looked out across a small patch of earth and a narrow strip of grass. The yard was ordinary. A fold-out chair near the back step. A plastic bin with yard tools. A bag of potting soil that had been cut open and rolled over on itself. The ordinary is where the worst things often learn to live. At the base of the garden window, the officers saw the first sign that the ordinary had been interrupted. Dirt darker than its neighbors. A subtle dip in the ground. Edges that looked handmade rather than weather-made. One officer crouched and touched the soil with 2 fingers. It was damp in a way that didn't match the day. "What are we looking at?" the other asked. Jonathan answered without looking at them. "He's there." "Who?" "I don't want to say his name." He swallowed and then said, "Jasper." A detective soon arrived. Then another. Crime scene procedures exist for a reason, and those reasons multiply when a body may be present. The detectives noted the shovel near the fence line, its blade still marked by damp earth. They saw the layering. Thin plastic like trash bags torn from a roll, a heavier tarp folded badly, strips of plastic wrap clinging to a corner of ground where it peeped through the soil. It didn't take training to see that something had been wrapped and lowered and covered in a hurry. The detectives kept Jonathan where they could watch him, but out of the way while they secured the scene. The backyard wasn't excavated immediately. That requires more hands and the careful eyes of a crime scene unit. But the first layer of truth had appeared. There was a grave here, shallow and recent. That matched the call. It did not answer the rest. "Tell us what happened," a detective said as they moved Jonathan to the shade of the side yard, away from the direct stare of neighbors who had begun to notice the uniforms and the tape. His story started simple. A bad man. a threat, a decision he regretted. But the edges frayed whenever the questions got close to a timeline. He had met Jasper through a neighbor, he said. Jasper had been staying in a truck in Jonathan's driveway, he said. When asked where the truck was, he paused. Gone, he said. Towed, a detective asked. Yes, Jonathan answered, and then he blinked like someone waking from a light sleep. No, I'm not sure. The backyard whispered a different story, one of rush and repetition. The wrapping, the layering, the shallow depth, the fresh topsoil. It all looked like work done by a person who wanted it to end quickly, but also feared it coming undone. The detectives recorded the scene with methodical calm, camera after camera, angle after angle, knowing that the yard might forget these details in a day if the weather turned, and the case would depend on what the lenses remembered. Jonathan's voice changed as the afternoon ended. He shifted from present tense to past tense, and then back again. He apologized to no one and to everyone. He asked if anyone had called his landlord. He asked about his son. He asked what would happen next. The detectives saved their patience for the places where it mattered most. When a person wants to talk, you let them talk, and you watch for the parts that sound rehearsed, for the parts that sound like someone finally saying something they've been trying not to say. 2 months, he offered without being asked. It happened 2 months ago. 2 months, the detective repeated, because repetition can reveal whether a detail is a memory or a script. Jonathan nodded. 2 months. He looked at the spot under the garden window and spoke like someone narrating a scene in which he no longer recognized himself. I didn't dig very deep. I couldn't. The sun shifted. The tape held. The neighbors watched, and the ordinary day gave way to an ordinary evening with something extraordinary at its center. The call had brought officers to a house where a man had said there was a body in the yard. The yard had agreed. The rest of the case would try to determine whether the words and the dirt were telling the same story or only pretending to. Before anyone lifted a single scoop of soil, the crime scene unit laid down the rhythm that keeps chaos from stealing answers. Photograph, document, measure, protect. Every layer would be recorded before it was disturbed. The grave under the garden window was not deep, and that fact carried weight. Shallow graves suggest speed, fear, inexperience, or all three. They also suggest proximity. A person who digs close to a house sometimes wants to hide a crime and keep it close enough to watch. The first cuts in the earth were careful and square. The trowels moved like readers, line by line, making sure they didn't miss a word. Darker soil gave way to plastic. A gloved hand pinched a corner of torn trash bag. Another photo. Another note. Beneath the trash bag, a fold of heavier blue tarp. Beneath the tarp, more plastic, cling film that had bound something round at the edges. The air cooled in the pocket opened by the work. Smells that should have never been in a garden rose to the surface. At the same time, another team inventoried the yard beyond the grave. They marked the shovel by the fence. They bagged a pair of blue rubber gloves from a bin beside the steps. They looked for drag marks and found none. Whoever had moved the body had carried it or rolled it along the ground wrapped tight. In the dirt, a partial shoe pattern repeated near the window and again near the fence gate, a loop that spoke of trips back and forth. While the scene was being worked, 2 detectives kept Jonathan near, but not too near. They walked him through his account again, not changing their questions, but changing their order. It matters. When he told the story in the way that felt safest to him, he stuck to a narrow path. When the questions came from angles he hadn't planned for, he stumbled. He said Jasper's truck had been parked in the driveway. He said it had been there for a while. When asked whether any neighbors had complained, he grew vague. I don't know if they saw it, he answered. It was there, then it wasn't. Was it towed? It might have been. Do you have a tow receipt? No. Then where is the truck? I don't know. He rubbed his forehead, stared at the grass, and said, "I lied about the toe." The admission hovered between them like a bird that wasn't sure whether to land or fly away. He followed it with a defense. "I didn't lie about the killing." He wanted them to separate the lie he admitted from the crime he confessed. Inside the house, the search was limited and focused. Detectives looked for paperwork, phones, and anything that might point to the identity of the man Jonathan called Jasper. They found very little with that name. They did find signs of a home that had been lived in under stress, stacked mail, unopened, a refrigerator with more condiments than food, a bedroom with laundry arranged in piles that never found their machine. The autopsy would wait until the recovery was complete, but the scene already spoke in short, clear lines. The body was wrapped deliberately. The grave was shallow. The location was chosen for access, not secrecy. The layering of plastic suggested a person who was trying to invent a barrier between himself and what he had done. People who think of bodies as evidence wrap them to hide DNA. People who think of bodies as unbearable wrap them for the same reason. They close their eyes. They cannot look, but they also cannot leave. The first contradictions were small. Jonathan said he fired 3 shots. The neighbor's earlier report would suggest 2. He said the truck was towed. His own admission contradicted that. He said he had just met Jasper. Other indicators hinted at conversations and arrangements that lasted longer than a few days. The detectives did not argue with him about these pieces. They placed each one on the table and waited to see where it fit. As the recovery team lifted the last layer of plastic, the part of the story that had been told by a voice on a phone became a story told by the body it described. The remains were exactly where Jonathan said they would be. The chest showed what trauma often shows in cases like this, damage that a pathologist would later chart with care. The face was not shown to Jonathan. There are lines you do not cross on a scene for any reason other than necessity. The necessity here was to treat a person as a person even when everything else had failed them. Back at the side yard, Jonathan asked a question that revealed the orbit of his thoughts. "What happens to my son?" he said. "Not where he is now, but later, what happens?" That one sentence told the detectives they were entering not only a case with a body and a gun and a confession, but a case with a man who held tight to the one part of his life he thought could still be saved. They didn't answer. That wasn't their decision to make on a lawn on a weekday. The scene was closed down the way it had been opened, methodically. The grave area was covered, marked, and logged. The items bagged and labeled. The trowel line smoothed only in the notes and the photographs. Because once a scene is disturbed, the best thing you can do is disturb it in a way that allows anyone to return to it on paper and walk it again. Night crept in. Porch lights flicked on up and down the block. A neighbor stood with their arms crossed and a jaw set tight in a way that meant questions rather than accusations. The detectives collected their people and their evidence and left the tape in place. The house would hold until morning. The story, for now, held 2 truths at once. A man had confessed. The details he offered could not be trusted without proof. Cases like this live and die on timelines. When did a person last see the victim alive? When did the accused say the crime happened? What did neighbors hear and when? What movements did phones make? What purchases hit cards? In the days after the recovery, detectives chased the pieces that mark time: calls, texts, surveillance pings, and reports. One report, filed 2 months earlier, stood out. A neighbor had called about gunshots near Jonathan's home. The neighbor's boyfriend said the shots were spaced minutes apart, not in a single rapid burst. He also reported seeing a man pointing a gun into a truck. He could not say who that man was. He could say that he had not forgotten the shape of the moment. Those notes sat in a file until the day a man called 911 and said he killed someone and put him beneath a window. When detectives asked Jonathan to walk them through that earlier time, he said, again, 2 months. He placed the event back there, in that window where the neighbor's report lived. How many shots? They asked. He said, 3. They did not counter with 2, because they weren't sure yet. They wanted him to either hold to his number or let it change in his mouth as he thought. He held for a while. Then he said, maybe it was 2. He was sober now and he was not, because sobriety isn't just about substances. It's also about fear, and fear can make a sober person swallow facts they don't want to taste. He told them Jasper was new in his life. He told them Jasper had been introduced by a neighbor. He told them Jasper had stayed in a truck. He told them the truck had been towed. He told them it had not. He told them he had hidden the gun for a while. He told them someone had stolen it later. He told them many things, but the only parts that didn't wobble were the ones that could be checked in dirt. The detectives layered the truck question with simple follow UPS that didn't accuse. They just revealed. Where were the keys? How often did the engine run at night? Did anyone else complain about the noise or the sight of a stranger sleeping outside a family home? He said the keys were somewhere in the house. They later found a key that fit the missing vehicle on Jonathan's property, another quiet contradiction. He said the engine ran sometimes. No neighbor had called in a noise complaint, but one had called about the shots. In interviews, the tempo matters. You don't sprint a person to the finish line of a confession if you want the confession to hold up. You walk them, and you let them slow themselves when they fear what's ahead. The detectives asked Jonathan about the day he chose to bury a man in his yard. He said he did not dig deep because he could not. He said he used what he had in the house to wrap the body. He said he left the grave where he could see it because he didn't know what else to do. He said it like a person saying the quiet part at last. They asked Jonathan whether anyone else had been in the house in the days that followed the shooting he described. He said no. They asked whether he had told anyone before the 911 call. He said no. They asked what made him call now. He said he could not carry it any further. Sometimes that is a real answer. Sometimes it is the only one. As the timeline took shape, the contradictions weren't just irritants. They were signposts. The gunshots reported 2 months earlier. The claim of 3 shots that might be 2. The truck that was towed and then was not. The weapon that was hidden and then was stolen. The detectives didn't need every piece yet. They needed the next piece. Motive, which is often part truth and part story a person tells themselves to sleep. If you want cases told step by step, with proof before opinion, subscribe now and keep going with me. The next chapter is the motive that cracked Jonathan's calm. The weapon matters in any shooting. Jonathan said it was a Russian KN handgun. He also said it was missing. The phrase he used was simple. Someone broke in and took it. He didn't offer a date or a police report number. He didn't show a forced lock or a shattered frame. He just said it was gone. Detectives do not call a person a liar when a person could instead be mistaken or trying to save face. They look for ways to prove or disprove the need for that label. They checked pawn databases. Nothing. They checked local reports of stolen firearms matching that make. Nothing. They asked neighbors whether anyone had seen someone in or around the house when Jonathan wasn't home. Most said they kept to themselves. One said they noticed different cars at odd hours around the time of the earlier gunshots. None could say whether those cars belonged to Jonathan's guests or to passers-by lost on residential streets. More Lee-bearing than any lock or pawn slip were the phones. Who called whom and when tells a story without adjectives. Jonathan's call history showed anxiety-shaped clusters, bursts of short calls, pauses, and then long gaps. That alone means very little. But paired with interviews, it can confirm or cut a narrative. In this case, another name surfaced often in Jonathan's recent history, his landlord. The tone in their messages started civil, frayed around the edges as money tension appeared. and then dipped into something darker after the shooting Jonathan placed 2 months earlier. Within this tone, detectives looked for a fuse, a sentence that explained why Jonathan chose a gun and a grave. The fuse, when they found it, was not a threat to Jonathan's pride or property. It was a perceived threat to his child. He would talk about this more in the next interviews, but the first shadow of it lived in a landlord's notes, references to an argument, to a guest who came and stayed and made the house feel less like a home. The truck remained missing. The key recovered on Jonathan's property suggested it had been there long enough for a routine to form and then be broken. Detectives ran vehicle databases, watched for plate hits in surrounding counties, and listened for tips from people who might have seen a similar model parked too long under a tree. The truck stayed quiet. Missing vehicles often do until someone needs them again. Back at the lab, the layers from the yard were logged for trace. The torn trash bags, the tarp, the plastic wrap, each could hold hair, fiber, or prints. On their own, these items are not dramatic. In court, they are anchors. A case with a confession is still a case that must stand if the confession is recanted. Evidence speaks when memory refuses. Detectives also pulled the earlier call from the neighbor who reported the gunshots. The audio was brief, concerned, apologetic about calling, precise about what they heard. The boyfriend's added note, that he saw a man aiming a gun into a truck, gave shape to the scene Jonathan said existed. It did not prove who pulled the trigger. It did place a gun in a vehicle where Jonathan claimed they had been. The next step was to press on motive. Not because motive is required to prove a crime. Only the action and the person are, but because motive helps a jury understand the weight behind the actions. It also helps investigators sort out whether a story is a story or a reason. Motive often hides in a sentence that someone wishes they could take back. In Jonathan's case, that sentence did not come from him. It came from the man he called Jasper, or so Jonathan said. During a phone call with his landlord, Jonathan described an exchange that had cut straight through his composure. He said Jasper made a comment about selling Jonathan's 8-year-old son. Jonathan's voice, even in the retelling, showed the crack that runs through any parent at those words. Detectives approached this claim with the caution it deserved. On one side, a parent's fear is a real and powerful thing. On the other, words can be twisted by stress, alcohol, anger, or the need to justify something that cannot otherwise be justified. They looked for witnesses, messages, or any trace of this comment outside Jonathan's mouth. They didn't find a text saying it. They didn't find a recording. What they found were people who said Jonathan had been under pressure, job lost 3 months before, money tight, a guest in his driveway, a house that no longer felt like a safe place to raise a child. In interviews, Jonathan clung to the idea that Jasper was a bad man. He said it like a life raft. He also said there was no sexual relationship between them, pushing back against any rumor he thought might take root in the absence of facts. He mentioned a financial arrangement, but could not describe it cleanly. Work here and there, a promise to pay for staying on the property, help with something that never quite took shape. Detectives asked him to slow down and retell the moment he said pushed him over the edge. He described Jasper's comment about his son. He described the anger in his chest. He described the way the house felt too small, and the yard felt like a place where he could make the threat stop. He did not describe calling the police at that moment. He described getting a gun. Where was the gun? They asked. In the house, he said first. Later, he said he had hidden it, and then it had been stolen. The contradiction stood like a signpost pointing to a blank field. The investigators marked it and moved on. They had enough pieces to assemble a motive that a jury could understand even if they could not confirm every claim. A father believed a man in his orbit had threatened his child, and in that belief, he made a lethal choice. The path from belief to action matters in courtrooms. Was there time to call for help? Was there an immediate threat or a remembered one? Was the man in the truck armed? Did Jonathan aim to scare and then fire? Or did he aim to kill? The physical evidence would answer some of that. The trajectory of bullets, the wounds to Jasper's chest, the rapid burial that followed. The phones and prior calls would answer more. Jonathan's landlord, when interviewed, painted a picture of a tenant sliding into a storm. Rent behind, odd visitors, a truck that turned a driveway into a campsite. Concern grew into calls. Calls turned into conflict. Somewhere in that slope, a comment about a child set a fuse. Whether it was a real threat or an ugly attempt at power in an argument, the effect on Jonathan was the same in the story he told. He could not let this man stay. At this point in many cases, the public wants certainty. They want a clean motive and a straight line. Detectives know better. Real cases move like people do, stopping, starting, circling. They pressed on with what could be proved. The body under the window, the 2 wounds to the chest, the blue gloves, the keys, the gunshots reported by a neighbor 2 months before the call that began all this. The confession that arrived after 2 months of living with a grave. If you want careful, fact-first storytelling, not rumor, not shock, tap subscribe and keep going. The next chapter is the body story, and it never lies. A person's body tells the truth in a language pathologists have trained their whole lives to read. The remains recovered from Jonathan's yard were wrapped with intent. Trash bags torn from a roll, a blue tarp, plastic wrap that clung to itself in bands. The wrapping held in fibers from the house, skin cells, and the marks of hands that never meant to be souvenirs, but always are. The autopsy confirmed what the scene suggested. 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. The pattern of entry and the path of the bullets offered angles and distances. There were no defensive wounds typical of a struggle inside a small space. That does not mean there wasn't a struggle of a different kind. The kind that happens when one person is seated and another stands over a door frame. The absence of injury to the hands can mean many things. In this case, it likely meant surprise or control. The wrapping materials were tested. The blue rubber gloves found near the back steps carried trace consistent with yard work and with handling the layers used in the burial. The key recovered at the house fit locks tied to the missing truck registered in Jasper Brady's name. The name mattered because until that match, the man in the ground had been Jasper, only because Jonathan said so. Now a record attached to a name matched a key, and a key matched a missing vehicle. And a missing vehicle matched the story of a person living in a truck before he vanished. The question of sexual assault was raised and resolved by the medical examiner. No signs of sexual assault. That removed one possible motive. It did not remove the mix of anger and fear Jonathan said he felt. Autopsies can read the body. They cannot read the heart of the person who pulled the trigger. The layers remembered more than people do. Plastic wrap held hair consistent with both men who had lived around that yard, Jonathan's and Jasper's. The tarp held small particles from the garden window's sill, which suggested the package had brushed against the house on the way down. None of this felt cinematic. That is the point. Courtrooms do not need drama. They need details that hold still when fear starts to move the furniture around. Detectives returned to the idea of the weapon. Without the handgun, they had to triangulate. Bullet fragments can tell their own story, and these did. Caliber likely made class, and a path that matched the account of a shooting near a vehicle. They still had no proof of a theft. They did have proof that a gun had been fired, and that its absence now was convenient to the only person who could hand it over. Jonathan's interview posture shifted as the lab results settled in. He grew quieter. He kept asking about his son's future. He asked who would explain this to the boy. The detectives did not answer. They were building a case, not a family plan. But their notes were careful to mark the humanity that often sits beside horror. A father who, whatever else he had done, still looked at the horizon through his child's eyes. The public often asks why a person would wrap a body instead of calling for help. The simplest answer is the truest, because they know they did something that will change their life, and wrapping feels like pausing the change. It never works. It only delays the moment when the truth arrives in a white van and a steel table under bright lights. That moment came here, and the table told a story that matched the earliest, coldest parts of Jonathan's confession. Jonathan Welch did not enter the courtroom as a blank page. His history reached back to 2006, a stack of misdemeanors that by themselves would never predict a murder, but do sketch a life of poor choices and frayed judgment. Petty theft, underage drinking, child endangerment, small crimes that leave big marks when a prosecutor lays them side by side for a jury. None of those charges could prove what happened to Jasper Brady. But together they set the backdrop for how the court would read Jonathan's actions in 2020 and the choices he made after. The formal charges were clear: murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. The case file was heavier than the single word confession suggests. There were photographs of the yard at every stage, tagged items and paper bags, a key tied to a truck that still hadn't been found, blue gloves, broken plastic, a tarp with soil and windowsill grit, and the autopsy that set down in unshakable language what bullets had done. Missing from the file were the handgun and the vehicle. Missing, too, was any independent proof that Jasper had made the horrifying comment about Jonathan's son. Those absences mattered, and everyone in the courtroom knew they would matter more at trial. Prosecutors do not love uncertainty. They build cases like bridges. Each piece must carry weight, even if a piece behind it cracks. Here, they had the body, the wrapping, the grave, the neighbor's report of gunshots 2 months earlier, the recovered key, and most of all Jonathan's own words, first on the 911 call and then in on-scene admissions. They also had a timeline that left long gaps and a motive that came from the mouth of the only surviving witness. The decision in front of them was the decision that defines many hard cases. Go to trial and risk that a jury doubts the parts they cannot see, or cut a deal that guarantees prison for a very long time. Defense counsel read the same file with different eyes. They saw a man who called the police on himself rather than run. They saw missing pieces they could point to: no gun, no truck, no digital record of the exact words about the child. They saw the wrapping and the shallow grave and knew a jury would read those as guilt. But they also knew that juries look for reasons. A father's fear of a threat to his child is a reason some jurors might hold in their hands with more care than a prosecutor would like. The defense did not have to make Jonathan a hero. They only had to make some jurors unsure about what burned the fuse and whether the law allowed a different reading. Before either side could test those readings in full, the case took the turn that ends most trials before they begin. Jonathan agreed to plead. In 2022, 2 years after Jasper's death, Jonathan Welch pleaded guilty to 1 count of murder. The state, in exchange for avoiding a long and painful trial with holes they could not fill, agreed to a sentence that still kept the public safe for a very long time, an indefinite term of 15 years to life. That phrase, to life, matters as much as the number 15. It meant Jonathan would have a chance at parole, not a guarantee of release. He would be eligible in 2035. The decision then would belong to a different room, a different panel, and a different set of questions about remorse, rehabilitation, and risk. The plea did not erase the other charges. Tampering and abuse of a corpse lived inside the narrative of the murder itself and were absorbed into the resolution. Prosecutors laid on the record the facts that supported those counts: the wrapping, the burial, the delay between the shooting and the confession. The judge asked Jonathan the questions that courts ask to make sure a plea is real. Do you understand the rights you give up? Are you entering this plea because you are guilty? Has anyone forced you? Jonathan answered quietly but clearly. He said the word guilty in a room built to hear it. Even with a plea, the unresolved pieces still tugged at the edges. Where was the truck? Led after lead sent detectives down old roads. A jailhouse tip from a cellmate, who claimed to know where the vehicle had been abandoned, took officers to an empty lot and then to a storage yard with nothing that matched Jasper Brady's plates. The weapon remained missing, and though ballistic analysis of fragments painted the outline of a Russian-patterned handgun, the actual firearm never surfaced. The absence of these objects would have been trial problems. After the plea, they became facts the community had to accept as permanently blank lines. Impact statements, read by families, are often the most human part of a criminal case. Jasper Brady was 33. Behind that number was a family that asked, in so many ways, the oldest question people ask in courtrooms. Why? There are cases where the answer is clean. This was not one of them. Jonathan's explanation, fear for his son, anger at a sentence he said Jasper spoke, stood next to the facts of 2 bullets to the chest, a wrapped body, and a shallow grave outside a window. The court cannot make those 2 things fit. It can only mark them both and decide what they demand in years. The judge spoke about the gravity of taking a life and the choices Jonathan made before and after the shooting. He spoke about the community's right to safety and the victim's right to dignity even after death. He imposed the agreed sentence and reminded Jonathan that parole boards do not read promises, they read records. Between 2022 and 2035, the only story Jonathan could control would be the one he wrote with behavior, programs, and whatever remorse looks like when it is finally real. Outside the courthouse, the microphones waited. Some cases create crowds. This one created quiet. Reporters asked the questions they always ask. Do you feel justice was done? What do you want people to remember? The answers were careful because careful was all anyone had left. A life had ended. Another life would now be lived inside walls. The weapon and the truck were gone. The truth, in the only way truth can be formalized in a system run by people, had been entered on the record. There is a reason many cases end with pleas. Trials are engines built to test stories, and stories with missing parts can grind themselves into dust under that pressure. A plea is not a shortcut to truth. It is a choice about risk, about mercy, about certainty. In this case, it was also a way to stop reopening a grave in the minds of everyone who had stood around it. The end of a case in court is not the end of a case in a community. After Jonathan Welch's plea and sentence, people in Marin County were left with a list of answers and a list of questions. They knew who pulled the trigger because he said so, and because the evidence agreed. They knew where the body was found and how it had been wrapped. They knew when neighbors heard gunshots and what the autopsy showed. But they did not know where Jasper's truck had gone, and they did not know where the gun had gone, and they did not have any proof outside Jonathan's mouth that Jasper had ever said the sentence about the child that Jonathan built his motive around. Those gaps matter for more than curiosity. They shape how people grieve. Some wanted to believe Jonathan had acted from fear, even if that fear took him to a place the law could never bless. Others saw in the plastic and the shallow dirt a different story. Not fear, but control. Not panic, but planning. The truth may sit between those readings or outside them altogether. What we can say without guessing is what the evidence said. 2 shots to the chest, a body wrapped in layers, a burial close enough to see from a window, a call to 911 2 months later from a man who said he could not live with the weight any longer. Investigators did not stop asking about the truck and the gun just because the case had a sentence attached to it. They followed the cellmate's tip and then others. They visited scrap yards, storage yards, ravines where vehicles go to be forgotten. They rechecked pawn entries and online sales for a matching handgun. Time is the enemy of answers at work like this. Metal rusts. Memory chooses peace over accuracy. People who once thought about helping choose to help themselves instead. That is not cynicism. It is the practical gravity that pulls at every open line in a file. Victim services met with Jasper's family and with those around Jonathan who were shaken by the facts and by the way those facts arrived. A counselor said something simple that stuck with the detectives who heard it. Grief grows best around specifics. In this case, specifics were both abundant and missing. Abundant in the physical things we could point to. Missing in the lines that most people need to heal. Why here? Why then? Why like this? The law can answer only a few of those questions. It can say what penalty attaches to murder. It can say how long a person must serve before they can ask to come home. It can say whether actions after a killing, wrapping, hiding, add to the weight. It cannot say what exact combination of fear, anger, pride, and panic turned a man in a driveway into a man in a grave. That limitation frustrates people who want the world to be tidy. It also protects us from a system that pretends to read minds when what it should read are records. Jonathan will, if he lives to see it, sit in front of a parole board in 2035 and answer questions that are different from the ones he answered in 2020. They will ask about programs completed and about disciplinary tickets. They will ask him to describe what he did without hiding behind euphemisms. They will ask him what he thinks about when he thinks about Jasper. They will ask him what he would say to a child who wants to understand how fear can be real and still not justify what came next. Those are hard questions because they have no smart answers, only honest ones. Every true crime story ends in the same place if we let it, with a person who is gone and a set of choices that cannot be unmade. This case adds one more lesson to the stack. Evidence outlives opinion. The yard held what the phone call started. The neighbor's report found its place in the timeline. The plastic and the tarp and the blue gloves locked the scene in long after the scene had been cleared. The missing weapon and the missing truck remind us that even strong cases have shadows. We live with that because we have to. If you are here because you want stories told clearly, with simple words and all the facts we have, that is what we will keep doing. We won't guess to make a cleaner story. We won't decorate a tragedy. We will follow the proof, and when there is a gap, we will say there is a gap. If this careful, step-by-step approach matters to you, tap subscribe, like to help the work reach more people, and comment the next case you want told with this same clarity. Your voice helps decide which file comes off the shelf next, and your support keeps these stories focused on what can be shown, not just what can be said.